Hey guys, it's the Plant Doctor here. What I want to do today is a comprehensive review of Japanese maples. Perhaps my favorite ornamental tree to use in the landscape, just because of the number of cultivars that we have and the number of colors that we have, and the numbers of shapes and sizes. There's almost a use for a Japanese maple in every landscape where we can grow these plants. So let's first look at the leaves of Japanese maple. We can break the Japanese maple leaf down into two different categories. We have the fine textured Japanese maple. Some people refer to these as dissectum. This particular one I have in my hand is waterfall, and there's several that are this fine leaf textured. Off the top of my head, there's waterfall, there's orangeola, there's tamukiyama, there's garnet, there's a bunch of different ones that you can access. The other type that we have are the more broadleaf ones. This large one here is bloodgood. So bloodgood has a broader leaf. A few other examples of some cultivars that would have broader leaves: sangukaku, or the coral bark Japanese maple. Araucaria is over here to my left as well. Skeeter's broom, Twombly's red sentinel. All of these cultivars are going to have a broadleaf. So we got two types of leaves here with Japanese maples. We have our dissectum or lace leaf types, and then we have our more broadleaf types. In terms of color, there's really three types of color that we can break Japanese maples down into. The first one, like this bloodgood here, are reds. There's lots of red cultivars out on the market. Perhaps none other more popular than the bloodgood Japanese maple. We have just standard greens, and then we have some that actually have variegation. For example, this one here is Geisha Gone Wild. And so Geisha Gone Wild has a white margin around the edge, and it actually has little dabs of pink in it as well. For examples today, I'm using all small trees. I actually grafted all these trees personally by hand. If you're interested in learning how to graft a Japanese maple, I did a video on that. I'll do my best to link it above my head up here somewhere. When we're talking about color on Japanese maple, the new growth has the best color. And then as the new growth matures, it hardens off, and we progress through the summer months. We get into July and August. You may see your Japanese maple lose some of that initial great color flush that it had in the spring. I got a perfect example. I'll shoot some B-roll film of it. I've got a tamukiyama that I grafted last year. I just planted it a couple months ago. The new growth, bright red. The older growth is a little bit more of a greenish, crimson-y color. But that's just something to be aware of. There's nothing wrong with your tree if it does that. That's just what Japanese maples do. So the next thing I want to talk about, we've talked about the shapes of Japanese maples. We've talked about the leaf textures of Japanese maples. Let's talk about height. Height is very cultivar dependent. Some cultivars will get 20 to 30 feet tall. I've seen some bloodgoods get really tall. Twombly's red sentinel is another one that can get tall. Emperor 1 is one that can get tall. There's others, they might get chest high. Some of the weepers, like a Crimson Queen or a tamukiyama, those will get, they're more of a bush form. All right? They get as wide as they do tall. So, and then we have some that can get really narrow. I've already mentioned Twombly's red sentinel. It gets maybe 20 feet tall, but it may only get 6 or 7 feet around. So there's lots of different types of shapes when we think about Japanese maple. Discuss where we can grow Japanese maples. In general, with our Japanese maples, these are going to be zones 5 to 9 plants, and in zone 9 they can be marginal. I've got a good friend that lives down in Tallahassee, which is, I believe, a solid zone 9. So Tallahassee's in the panhandle of Florida in the United States, if you're watching this internationally. It gets very warm there. They occasionally have freezes, but they have very long hot summers, and sometimes in those climates, Japanese maples do not fare very well with that. In general, in terms of where we plant these, we want them to have part shade or part sun. Those two terms are interchangeable with each other. And we define part shade as 4 to 8 hours of direct sunlight, preferably with Japanese maples. We want that to be morning sun. If you can give these guys some afternoon shade, they are going to thrive for you. They're going to do very well. There are some cultivars that do good in the sun. I've got an Emperor one in my yard. It's about 4 years old now. It's the first Japanese maple I ever grafted. Does great, does fantastic. It gets a ton of sun and it's fine. But some of these in particular, some of the more finer textured leafed Japanese maples, what we see is they want a little more shade, in particular afternoon shade. So if you can provide them some morning sun, give them some afternoon shade, they're going to be very, very happy. One thing I should include about planting Japanese maples in terms of where to plant them, in general, they do very well in planters. If you're on the northern extreme of where we can grow Japanese maple, so you're in that zone 5, I know some people even try to grow them in zone 4, and that's getting up around the Great Lakes region in the United States. If you have them in a planter, they may not survive until the next spring. It may get too cold. So if you have them in a planter, once they go dormant, if you can pull them in the garage, provide them with a little bit of insulation from that extreme cold, that -10, -20 degrees that some of our friends further north get, they'll do okay in a pot. If you're zone 6, zone 7, zone 8, zone 9, these will do good in a pot. Here again, give them some afternoon shade and they'll do just fine. One thing I want to talk about with Japanese maples is fall color. Perhaps no other genus of trees has better fall color than acer. So Japanese maples are going to be in the genus acer, so that includes red maples and sugar maples, and just a whole box elder actually has decent fall color as well. They all have great fall color. The great thing about a Japanese maple is the breadth of color that we're going to get with fall coming on. You're going to have bright reds, you're going to have bright oranges, you're going to have bright yellows, and I joke around with my students at Snead State when we take up Japanese maples in class, and I say some of these cultivars, their fall color is so bright you need a pair of sunglasses to look at them. I mean, just great fall color. It's one of my favorite features about the Japanese maple. And some of these cultivars, at least where I'm at, is on 7B, 8A in that range. They hold their fall color for 6, sometimes 8 weeks. I mean, great fall color, and it's not a 3 or 4 or 5 day thing. It is weeks and weeks and weeks of fall color. So if you're looking for a tree that is going to provide you with some nice fall color, Japanese maple is a good place to start. Let's talk about watering your Japanese maple. So when I water Japanese maple, regardless if it's in a pot or if it's in the ground, we want to water very thoroughly and then let it completely dry out. And then water very, very thoroughly again. So if it's in the ground and it's established, I may not water it at all. If I'm getting rain once every 5 to 7 days, I'm not even going to water it. If I go 7, 10 days and it hasn't rained at all, I'll water it. I'll saturate it, I'll let it go completely dry, and I'll repeat that process. Now in a pot, that's a little different. If you have a potted Japanese maple, what you want to do is water when your pot is dry. So I'll take my finger and I'll stick it down in the pot, maybe the length of my index finger. If the soil is dry that far down, I need to go ahead and water. Japanese maples do not like wet feet. If you live in a heavy clay soil and you want to plant a Japanese maple, one thing that you want to consider is amending your soil. I did a video on how to plant Japanese maples. I'll leave the link up here. Watch that video. I do a special section for our friends with heavy clay soils, how to amend the soil so it's just not constantly holding some water. Where I'm at, it's not a big deal. I have sandy soils. I can plant these just in native soil, not a problem at all. But when you water, don't have them constantly saturated. Saturate them, let them completely dry out, and then saturate them again. And your Japanese maples will be really, really pleased with your watering regimen. One thing that's often overlooked when most people are assessing or looking to buy a Japanese maple is the graft scar. So if you're buying a name cultivar, look for a graft scar on your Japanese maple. If you can't find a graft scar, you're not buying a grafted or a named Japanese maple. Japanese maples are not true to seed. For example, if I were to take seeds off of this bloodgood and plant them, each of the progeny are going to look a little bit different. They'll probably favor bloodgood, but they will not be a true bloodgood Japanese maple. So to identify the graft scar is really easy. All you have to do is look on the branch and you'll see a difference in coloration from the bottom part and the desirable part on the top. Oftentimes you'll see a scar or a swell there as well. And one thing we need to talk about that graft union is never put anything around that graft union. Don't put a bunch of soil on top of it. Don't put a bunch of mulch on top of it. That's a bad idea. That's a good way to get your Japanese maple severely injured or killed, is to cover up that graft union in some way. With fertilizer and pruning, I did a video on how to prune a Japanese maple. Here again, I'll leave that link here. We want to prune these right before they come out of dormancy. So I prune mine usually around Valentine's Day, give or take, because mine will start to bud up really heavy in March, and then by the first part of April, they're putting out new growth. So if you have a Japanese maple, it needs extensive pruning. That's the time to do it. If you have a dead branch, obviously you can take that out at any time. With young juvenile Japanese maples, some of the cultivars will throw off wild leggy branching. I've got the perfect example. I just planted 2 coral bark Japanese maples that I grafted 2 years ago. These trees are 2 years old, and they've got these leggy limbs coming off of them. And what I need to do is go in and cut like half of that new growth back. It's not going to hurt your tree to take off a little bit of growth in the months of July and August and September. You can take that off anytime. Also with your mounding Japanese maples, if they're getting too wide, if they're getting into other plants, you can go ahead and prune that back a little bit as well. You're not going to hurt anything, but extensive pruning, do it right before it comes out of dormancy. In terms of fertilizing your Japanese maples, I fertilize my Japanese maples once a year. And I use a slow release fertilizer. So I'm using a fertilizer that's a 90-day prill, and I'll put that out just as the plant is breaking dormancy. So that's usually around April. I'll go out and I'll put a handful of fertilizer around each tree, and that's all they need. Don't hit your Japanese maples with liquid fertilizer, something like Miracle-Gro. It doesn't need that. We're not putting on tons of new growth. We don't want to encourage tons of new growth with Japanese maples either. You get those long leggy limbs, it's not healthy for the tree to continuously have lots of nitrogen load on it. Slow release fertilizer. I'll try to leave a link down in the description below for some good fertilizer. A good example would be Osmocote. I know there's other brands out there that they brand themselves specifically for Japanese maples. I'll try to leave a link for some of those as well. But if you've got Osmocote at home and you're using Osmocote in your hanging baskets or your other plants, that's a good fertilizer to use as well. In terms of pest, I really don't see pest get on my Japanese maples, and I have lots of different cultivars of Japanese maples. Occasionally I've seen some scale get on the bark, and that's it. I mean, I can hand pick them off. I can probably count on one hand the number of scales I've picked off of a Japanese maple. One thing that I will say about Japanese maple, I've had an issue with this, I've seen issues with this in the past, is when the deer begin to rut. So that's when they mate, and for me that's usually somewhere in November, December time frame. The bucks start chasing the does around and the bucks are fighting. The bucks like to mark their territory by rubbing their antlers on the tree, and I've seen deer kill a Japanese maple by rubbing the bark off of the tree. So that's just something to be aware of. You can avoid that pretty easily if you live in an area that has a lot of deer. You can put a little circular fence, a cylinder type fence around the bark of your tree, and so the deer can't rub on it. So when the buck comes through to mark his territory, he's not going to use your tree to do it. Guys, as always, thank you for watching The Plant Doctor. I can't believe we've got over 3,000 subs now. I feel like I've just started this venture, and that's because of you guys, so thank you. You guys hit that like button, you hit the sub button, you've shared my videos with your friends and your fellow gardeners, and so I want to thank you for that. And until next time, happy gardening.